So although when you look at these legally and you say, well, is this a huge change? I mean, the answer is no, it's not a huge change legally. It builds on commitments that we've already got in terms of transparency and publication. But it is going to be an increase in that area, and I think there's going to be an increase of focus on it. And the other side that is coming forward, and I've put this in detail because I thought the slides will go up on the website. You will be able to look at those, so they are then a resource. So, you know, don't worry if you obviously you can't read them, I think, from that distance. But the other side that is next to this is on freeing up information for reuse. Now, we have had, and again, this is kind of more of the same. This isn't something completely different, but far more of a push on it. And I think that can be quite challenging because one of the things that when you're outsourcing, there is an information sort of benefit sometimes to the provider, and they will be very keen to utilise some of the benefits of that information. The reuse provisions, are people familiar with the concept of reuse and what these regulations might even... It's a terrible silence. I can tell you, yes, but I mean, just when I say reuse, are people all going, oh, yeah, we know all about that, we know all about this? No, right. Right, well, there is a European commitment to free up information generated and produced by the public sector for wider commercial use. In the States, information produced by the public sector as part of its workings, as part of all its statistics, all its information about spending, about all the intellectual property that it produces, is available to the private sector to be used to produce new products, geographic products, intellectual property products. There is a huge market there. Now, there are a set of regulations from Europe saying that we must do the same, and there has been a real, I think, issue in the UK that the UK has not had a real commitment to this, partly because we had a preceding sort of policy that said, well, we will try and utilise public sector information for the benefit of the public purse. So there were, policies about selling, trading funds that actually sold information. Now, we've had a change in that over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of the law, but it hasn't really been pushed forward as a policy. And what this is doing, this element of government policy, is actually saying, no, we do need to push this forward as a policy to release the information that is produced as a resource in the public sector for reuse to stimulate the economy and to stimulate economic growth. And it is also seen as a way of increasing public participation and accountability. I'm not wholly convinced about that, but I mean, I can see that politically might well be seen as an approach. So if you take these together, these policy movements, I think what you are seeing is a commitment to make outsourcing a great deal more transparent. And that will feed through into your processes, your policies, the way that you deal with outsourcing contracts, the way that you deal with the strategy right from the word go, and the information that is then produced. And I would say that those are the big changes rather than very specific, detailed legal changes. So just a couple of legal changes. I mean, one that would be, I think, a real change and that I think you would have to take account of in outsourced contracts would be if you got a security breach notification obligation. This is a legal obligation, if there is a breach of security, to notify the individuals whose data has been potentially compromised. It applies in the United States. I think 43 states actually have breach notification obligations, and it can impose a very significant financial burden. Now, that I think would be something that really you would have to look at in terms of an outsourced contract if that were going to be on the cards. You would certainly have to look where the risk lay and where the cost was going to lie. And you would certainly want an outsourced provider to be responsible for any cost involved. You would want to be responsible for determining whether a notification should be given. And I can see that being commercially, quite a difficult negotiation. At the moment, we have got a provision in a changed directive which is imposing that obligation on telecoms providers, and that will come in next May. But I think in the long term, we will see the law moving in this area. It has happened in the US, and I think it will happen. Although I've put there are no serious breach notification proposals around just at the moment. But I think it's one of the things to look at when you're future-proofing contracts, when you're looking at outsourcing going forward. There are also now extraordinarily strong, I think, for data protection, fining provisions from the Information Commissioner. The Information Commissioner can fine up to £500,000 for a security breach. The legal obligation will always rest with the public authority, which will always remain legally responsible for data protection compliance. So again, I think it is very important, looking at your contract terms and your outsourcing arrangements, to ensure that you have appropriately dealt with the potential risk that exists, because there is a significant increased risk here. One other legal change, there has been a change to the standard form of model contract used for overseas processors. So if you use overseas processors, and no doubt, I think this is probably a level of detail that your lawyers will worry about, rather than perhaps being one for you to worry about from a policy level. Overall, in terms of data protection, I've said there are no big changes. There are lots of noises coming out of Europe, but actually the big issue for Europe at the moment is dealing with the Lisbon Treaty and the implementation of data protection following on from that. So just concluding then on the challenges for outsourcing, there are challenges that sort of sit in the broader legal world around cloud computing, the use of services where the service provider is not necessarily tying themselves to producing to a particular area, a particular domain. And basically, the answer for anybody who is in the public sector who is outsourcing any personal data, and in the public sector it is nearly always personal data that ends up being outsourced because it is a people industry. You cannot accept a cloud computing solution without knowing where the services are being provided, how they're being provided, having all those assurances. I don't think on big outsourcings it's an issue, but it is an issue for things like universities using Google and Microsoft services, where they're offering them at either free or at very reduced prices in order to get a foothold. I think that increased pressure for transparency is soft-edged in the sense of being soft law rather than necessarily hard law, but there is a strong policy pressure, and I think contracts do need to take account of those. There are bigger legal changes, I think, coming up in privacy, but they're not ones, in my view, that are going to impact upon the straightforward outsourcing contractual provision. So I hope that has picked up the FOI and DP ones on outsourcing. I am mortified that I have not got an amusing video or, anything of that nature. The best I can do is a very quick anecdote, particularly for ladies, and a piece of advice. If you regularly get the London train, as I do, wear Mary Janes. In other words, shoes that are held firmly on by a strap. Because not long ago, getting the 6 o'clock train from Macclesfield to London, as I stepped onto the train, my shoe fell into the gap between the platform and the train. And I made terrible signals like this to a man on the platform who just said, "Get on the train." I thought, well, I have to get on the train. I have to go to a meeting in London. And I limp onto the train, and I sit there going through, what do I do when I get to Euston? Do I hop? Do I take off the other shoe? Do I make it to a taxi and say, "Take me to the nearest shoe shop"? Which, is slightly, do I turn up at my meeting just with the one shoe? They'll say, "Oh, she's from Manchester, just the one shoe," what do I do? And I'm sitting there going through these eventualities, and then something even worse happened, because down the train I see a really hangdog chap who's in a sort of shabby uniform, and he's got a droopy moustache. And you know those things they have rubbish, they pick up rubbish on? He's got one. And on the end is my shoe. And he's walking down the train going, ladies' shoe, ladies' shoe. And I'm thinking, oh, God, and people are looking at it. It was no longer new, this shoe, and sneering. And I'm thinking, I'm going to have to say, that's mine. And I finally did. I said, well, that's mine. And he said, oh, ladies' shoe, and he dropped it. And the only good news is I didn't have to marry him.